Shapes appeared, but no one moved. No command was spoken, yet nothing dared move.
Dust moved where no one dared to shift.
Eyes lowered, not in respect, but in surrender. Between each breath, the air tightened further. The corridor ended, but the silence did not. At the threshold, the air grew heavier than the stone. This was not a funeral. It was the movement of an empire. Control did not loosen, it deepened. Even the ground remembered. Every movement pressed into it. At the center, something waited without being seen. Each step forward narrowed the world behind. What held the center was not seen, only obeyed. Structure emerged, where emptiness once held. At the edge of structure, something waited beneath the cloth. It was no longer hidden, only veiled. Form took shape, but meaning remained beyond reach. The closer it came, the less the world mattered. The center was no longer distant, it was undeniable. Edges became clearer, but meaning did not. The surface gave shape, but concealed everything beneath. It held everything above it, and nothing could pass through. Even the light refused to settle upon it. The more it was revealed, the more it withdrew. The center was complete, yet unreachable. It no longer needed to be seen. It only needed to exist. Distance returned, but the weight remained. Where it once stood, Only absence remained. What was gone still commanded the space. The space widened, but nothing was released. The sky itself seemed to bow under it. Nothing stood above it, yet everything bent around it.
From above, it felt less like a place, and more like a force.
Nothing remained to be seek, yet nothing could be ignored. The world did not end, it simply lost its center. Everything continued, but nothing moved forward. What remained was not silence, but weight without motion. Nothing changed, and that was the change. What could be seen had ended. What remained could not be shown. Even time seemed to hesitate here. What stood ahead was no longer a path, only continuation without end. Even the smallest movement carried the weight of everything around it. In Sidit, there was no distance, only pressure without relief. What followed behind was never separate from what moved ahead. No matter where the eye moved, it found the same motion continuing. Even when partially hidden, the movement never lost its scale. As it rose in view, it revealed only more of what could not end. Across every direction, it remained equally without end. There was nothing left to follow. Only something left to remain. From this angle, the movement revealed no edge, only continuation. Even the wind seemed to follow their direction, never moving against them. It did not end, it settled into something that would not leave. It could not be seen, yet it could not be removed.
It would not fade, because it was never meant to leave.
There was no ending to witness, only something that would continue without being seen. The ground remembered every step, even when no one looked down. It remained, because nothing could replace it. It would remain, long after anything that could see it was gone. Nothing could follow it, because nothing remained outside it. There was no outside anymore, only what remained within. Nothing could begin again, because nothing had ever ended.
Even the idea of ending had no place here.
There was no end to reach, because it had already been reached. Nothing remained to be revealed, because everything was already exposed.
There was nothing left to compare it to, because nothing else remained.
There was no longer anything to become, because it had already become everything. There was no longer a boundary between what was and what would remain. There was no longer anything to follow, because nothing moved anymore. There was no longer a direction to follow, because nothing moved anymore. There was no longer anything to measure, because nothing could change.
There was no longer a place to arrive at, because everything was already here.
There was no longer anything to wait for, because nothing could arrive. There was no longer anything to expect, because nothing could come. There was no longer anything to say, because nothing could be different. There was no longer anything to question, because nothing could be otherwise.
There was no longer anything to separate, because everything had already become one. There was no longer anything beyond it, because nothing could exist outside it.
There was no longer anything beyond this, because nothing could exist after it. There was no longer anything to become aware of, because nothing could be different.
There was no longer anything to remember or forget, because nothing could ever be different again.
There was no longer anything to lose, because nothing remained separate.
There was no longer anything to carry, because nothing could fall away.
There was no longer anything to understand, There was no longer anything after this, because nothing could ever follow. There was no longer anything beyond this moment, because nothing could ever follow it. There was no longer anything to return to, because nothing had ever left. There was no longer anything to hold within, because nothing could exist inside or outside. There was no longer anything to define or dissolve, because nothing could change its state. No longer anything to return toward, because nothing had ever truly left. There was no longer anything to hold more meaning.
There was no longer anything to continue or correct, because nothing could be corrected anymore.
There was no longer anything to complete, because completion itself had dissolved.
There was no longer anything to measure. There was no longer anything to compare, because comparison itself no longer exists.
There was no longer anything to witness, because witnessing itself had already ended.
No longer anything to